In the winter of 1943, in a small barbershop tucked into a narrow side street of Warsaw, Poland, a man named Eugeniusz Wazowski stood behind his leather barber chair, straight razor in hand, watching through his frost-covered window as German officers marched past in their perfectly pressed uniforms. The shop smelled of bay rum and hot towels, the same scents that had filled this space for 3 generations. But everything else had changed. The Nazis had transformed Warsaw into a nightmare of checkpoints, curfews and public executions. Yet somehow, impossibly, Wazowski's barbershop remained one of the few places where high-ranking German officers felt comfortable enough to let their guard down, to lean back in the chair, close their eyes, and surrender their necks to a Polish barber's blade. They had no idea they were sitting in the chair of a man who had already decided to kill them, not with the razor, but with something far more insidious, something they would never see coming until it was already inside them, replicating in their blood. Wazowski was not a soldier, not a spy, not even a member of the Polish resistance in any official capacity. Before the war, he had been exactly what he appeared to be, a neighborhood barber who cut hair, trimmed beards, and listened to the gossip of working-class Poles who trusted him with their secrets and their Saturday mornings. He was 41 years old, soft-spoken, with gentle hands that never shook even when the straight razor glided across a customer's throat, and he had a wife and 2 young daughters who depended on him to stay invisible, to keep his head down, to survive. But Wazowski had also been a medical student before the Great Depression forced him to abandon his studies, and he remembered enough about disease, about transmission, about the microscopic wars fought inside the human body, to understand that there were weapons more terrifying than bullets, weapons that could slip past every checkpoint, every inspection, every interrogation, and strike at the heart of an enemy who believed themselves untouchable. Thus, the Germans loved routine, loved cleanliness, loved the ritual of a proper shave administered by skilled hands in a warm, quiet room where they could pretend, for 20 minutes, that they were not occupiers but gentlemen. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, officers from the local command would arrive at Wazowski's shop, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, always expecting the same treatment: hot towels scented with lavender, a close shave, a trim if needed, and absolute silence unless they initiated conversation. Wazowski had learned to read them, to anticipate their moods, to know when to nod sympathetically at their complaints about the Polish winter, and when to simply let the silence hang heavy while they dozed in the chair. He had become invisible to them, a piece of furniture, a function rather than a man, and that invisibility had become his greatest advantage because invisible men see everything, hear everything, and are never suspected of anything. What the German officers did not know, what they could not have known, was that Wazowski had been conducting an experiment, a deadly, desperate experiment born from equal parts scientific curiosity and burning rage. 6 months earlier, he had made contact with Dr. Stanisław Matulewicz, a former colleague from his medical school days, who now worked in secret with the Polish underground, and together they had developed a technique so audacious, so horrifying in its simplicity, that even the resistance leadership had been reluctant to approve it. They had discovered a way to culture live typhus bacteria, to keep it viable outside the human body for extended periods, and to transfer it through seemingly innocent means. Typhus, the ancient plague of armies and prisons, the disease that had killed more soldiers throughout history than all the bullets and bayonets combined, could be weaponized not with bombs or syringes, but with something as mundane and ubiquitous as barbershop towels. The plan was almost elegant in its horror. Wazowski would treat his German clients exactly as he always had, with the same courtesy, the same attention to detail, the same hot towels pressed against their freshly shaved faces. But certain towels, specially prepared towels that looked and smelled identical to all the others, would carry death in their fibers. The bacteria would transfer through the microabrasions left by the razor, invisible cuts so small the officers would never feel them, and within days the fever would begin. Within a week, the typhus would be coursing through their systems, and within 2 weeks some of them would be dead while others would be so debilitated they would never fully recover. The beauty of the disease from a tactical standpoint was its ability to spread. One infected officer would return to his barracks, share drinks with his colleagues, and the contagion would ripple outward, each new case creating chaos in the command structure, forcing quarantines, depleting medical resources, and most importantly, making the Germans afraid. But as Wazowski stood in his shop that winter morning, watching another officer approach his door, boots crunching in the snow, he understood the weight of what he was about to do. This was not warfare as poets described it, not glory or honor or the clash of armies on an open field. This was something darker, more intimate, a violation of every oath he had almost taken as a medical student, a betrayal of the trust that even an enemy placed in the hands that held the razor against their throat. Yet Warsaw burned every night. His neighbors disappeared into cattle cars bound for camps, whose names were whispered like curses, and children starved in the streets, while German officers ate 3 meals a day and complained about the quality of Polish vodka. The barbershop door opened. Cold air rushed in, and Wazowski smiled, nodded, and gestured toward the chair, his hand already reaching for a towel that had been soaking in a special basin since dawn. The officer who entered that morning was Hauptmann Friedrich Weiss, a logistics coordinator for the Wehrmacht's supply lines running through occupied Poland, a man in his mid-30s with thinning blonde hair and a fondness for discussing the superiority of German engineering, while Wazowski worked the lather into his cheeks. Weiss was not a monster in the theatrical sense, not a screaming sadist or a camp commandant with blood on his hands, but rather the bureaucratic kind of evil, the man who calculated train schedules that would efficiently transport stolen grain out of Poland while Polish farmers starved, who requisitioned wool coats from warehouses knowing that the families who had sewn them would freeze without them. He settled into the barber chair with a satisfied sigh, removing his cap and placing it carefully on the side table, completely unaware that this routine Tuesday appointment would be the moment his life began its irreversible descent into fever, delirium, and a hospital bed from which he would never truly recover. Wazowski moved through the ritual with practiced precision, stropping his razor against the leather belt that hung from the chair's armrest, the familiar scraping sound filling the small shop, while Weiss closed his eyes and began his usual monologue about the incompetence of his fellow officers. The barber listened with the same attentive silence he always maintained, nodding at appropriate moments, murmuring non-committal agreements, all while his mind raced through the procedure he and Dr. Matulewicz had rehearsed dozens of times in the basement of an abandoned pharmacy on the other side of the city. The typhus culture had been prepared 3 days earlier, mixed with a saline solution that allowed the bacteria to remain viable, then carefully applied to specific towels that Wazowski kept separate from his regular supply in a locked cabinet beneath the sink. The risk was enormous. If he contaminated himself, if he used the wrong towel by accident, if a single drop of the infected solution touched an open cut on his own hands, he would become patient zero of his own plague, and his family would watch him die in agony. The hot towel went on first, the safe one, steam rising from Weiss's face as the German officer relaxed into the warmth, his breathing slowing, his guard dissolving in the comfortable heat. Wazowski worked the shaving soap into a thick lather, applied it with smooth circular motions, and then began the shave itself, the razor gliding across Weiss's cheek with the confidence of a man who had performed this action 10,000 times. The blade was sharp, freshly honed that morning, and it left the skin smooth but also microscopically damaged, invisible abrasions that would serve as doorways for what was coming next. Weiss droned on about a shipping delay in Krakow, about lazy Polish workers who needed more discipline, about his plans to request a transfer to France where the weather was better and the wine was exceptional. And Wazowski responded with appropriate sounds of interest while reaching for the second towel, the one that had been soaking in the special basin, the one that carried death in its threads. The contaminated towel looked identical to every other towel in the shop, white, clean, folded in the same precise rectangle, warmed to the same temperature in the same metal basin. Wazowski lifted it with steady hands, shook it out with a practiced snap, and pressed it firmly against Weiss's freshly shaved face, holding it there for the prescribed 15 seconds while the German officer sighed with pleasure at the sensation. The bacteria transferred in that moment, sliding from fabric to skin, finding the micro-cuts left by the razor, beginning their invisible invasion of Weiss's bloodstream. The incubation period for Typhus was typically 10 to 14 days, which meant Weiss would leave this shop feeling refreshed and satisfied, would return to his office and his calculations and his efficient brutality, would sleep well for over a week before the first headache arrived, before the fever began its climb, before his body became a battlefield between his immune system and an enemy he never saw coming. Wazowski removed the towel, applied a cooling aftershave balm and helped Weiss from the chair, accepting the handful of zlotys the officer placed on the counter with a respectful nod. Weiss examined himself in the mirror, running a hand across his smooth cheek, expressing satisfaction with the work, and then departed into the cold Warsaw morning, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully as he left. The barber stood alone in his shop, staring at the contaminated towel now crumpled in the basin, and felt the weight of what he had just done settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. There was no turning back now, no way to undo the infection, no method to recall the bacteria now multiplying inside Weiss's body. The weapon had been deployed, silent and invisible, and all that remained was to wait for the fever to begin its work, to watch the German command structure in Warsaw begin to crack under the pressure of an enemy they could not see, could not fight, and could not understand. The first sign that the infection had taken hold came 11 days later, not from Weiss himself but from the sudden cancellation of appointments that had been scheduled weeks in advance. 3 German officers, who were regular clients of Wazowski's shop, failed to appear for their Tuesday slots, an unprecedented disruption in the rigid routine that the occupiers maintained with almost religious devotion. The barber stood by his window, watching the street, noting the unusual absence of Wehrmacht vehicles, the nervous energy of the Polish civilians who seemed to sense that something had shifted in the invisible balance of power. By Wednesday, whispers began circulating through the neighborhood. German officers were falling ill with mysterious fevers, the garrison infirmary had been placed under quarantine protocols, and military doctors had been summoned from Berlin to investigate what they initially suspected was a localized outbreak of influenza. Wazowski listened to these rumors with carefully controlled neutrality, expressing appropriate concern when questioned by neighbors, but inside his chest, his heart hammered with a mixture of triumph and terror because he knew exactly what was spreading through the German ranks, and he knew it was only beginning. Dr. Matulewicz made contact on the 4th day of the outbreak, appearing at the barber shop just before closing time with the pretense of needing a haircut, and in the careful coded language they had developed, confirmed what Wazowski had hoped and feared. Typhus had been positively identified in at least 7 officers, with more cases emerging daily. The German medical corps was in chaos, unable to determine the source of the infection, conducting inspections of food supplies, water sources and housing facilities, while completely overlooking the one place where their officers had all congregated, a humble barbershop where they had felt safe, relaxed and utterly vulnerable. Matulewicz's hands shook slightly as he relayed this information, his voice barely above a whisper, because both men understood the magnitude of what they had unleashed. Typhus was not a precision weapon, not a bullet that struck only its intended target, and if the infection spread beyond the German command into the general population of Warsaw, the consequences would be catastrophic for the very people they were trying to protect. The ethical calculation that Wazowski had made in those winter months was brutal in its clarity. The Germans had already condemned Warsaw to slow death through starvation, deportation, and systematic murder, and anything that disrupted their ability to efficiently administer that destruction was justified, even if it meant wielding disease as a weapon. He had studied the history of typhus, knew that it thrived in conditions of overcrowding and poor sanitation, knew that the German barracks with their fastidious hygiene protocols were actually less vulnerable to widespread outbreak than the cramped Polish quarters where families lived 10 to a room. The disease would burn through the officer corps like wildfire through dry timber, but it would struggle to establish itself in a population that had already been exposed to countless privations and had developed, through terrible necessity, a kind of biological resilience. It was a gamble, a calculated risk based on epidemiological data and desperate hope, and every morning Wazowski woke wondering if he had made a catastrophic mistake that would result in the deaths of thousands of innocent Poles. By the end of the second week, The German response had escalated from concern to panic. Hauptmann Weiss was dead, his body consumed by the fever in just 9 days, his final hours spent in delirious agony as his organs shut down one by one. 2 other officers were in critical condition, their prognosis grim, and the garrison commander had ordered a complete lockdown of all military facilities, cancelling leave, restricting movement, and demanding answers from medical personnel who had none to give. The Gestapo began conducting interrogations, rounding up Polish workers who had contact with German personnel, searching for saboteurs or poisoners, operating under the assumption that this outbreak was an act of deliberate biological warfare, but focusing their suspicions on kitchen staff, laundresses and cleaning crews. The barbershop, with its genteel atmosphere and its proprietor's servile demeanor, never appeared on their list of potential threat vectors because the Germans simply could not conceive that a man who had shaved them with such careful deference could be the architect of their destruction. Wazowski maintained his routine with iron discipline, opening his shop at the usual hour, arranging his tools with the same meticulous care, treating the few non-German clients who still dared to enter with the same professional courtesy he had always offered. He had disposed of the contaminated towels, burning them in his shop's furnace and scattering the ashes in the Vistula River, eliminating any physical evidence of his methodology. The Typhus culture itself had been destroyed, the glass containers shattered and buried in a location known only to him and Matulewicz, and both men had agreed to suspend any further operations until they could assess the full extent of what they had already set in motion. The weapon had been fired, the damage was spreading, and now they could only watch as the German command structure in Warsaw began to crack under the pressure of an invisible enemy that struck without warning, showed no mercy, and left the survivors weakened and terrified, jumping at every symptom, every headache, every slight elevation in temperature that might signal the beginning of their own descent into the fever. The true genius of Wazowski's method revealed itself not in the initial casualties, but in the secondary effects that rippled through the German occupation apparatus like cracks spreading across ice. Within 3 weeks of Weiss's death, the Wehrmacht had lost 17 officers to typhus, with another 32 hospitalized in various stages of the disease, and the psychological impact of these losses far exceeded their numerical significance. German soldiers who had marched through Poland with absolute confidence in their superiority now walked the streets of Warsaw with visible anxiety, avoiding contact with Polish civilians, refusing to eat in local establishments, and demanding that all personal services be provided exclusively by German personnel flown in from the Reich. The barbershop that had once been a refuge for officers seeking a moment of civilized normalcy now stood empty, its leather chair gathering dust, because the mere thought of allowing a Polish barber's hands near their throats had become intolerable to men who suddenly understood their own vulnerability in a way that no amount of partisan attacks or sabotage had ever taught them. The occupation authorities responded with the only tools they knew: violence, intimidation, and collective punishment. The Gestapo arrested 43 Polish medical workers on suspicion of deliberately spreading disease, subjecting them to interrogations that left 3 dead and a dozen permanently maimed. But the torture yielded nothing, because the prisoners genuinely knew nothing about the source of the outbreak. German hygiene inspectors descended on Warsaw like a plague of their own, shutting down restaurants, bakeries, and public facilities, imposing draconian sanitation requirements that were impossible for starving civilians to meet, and executing business owners whose establishments failed inspection. The irony was not lost on Wazowski. The Germans were now inflicting more suffering on Warsaw's population than the disease itself had caused, destroying livelihoods and lives in a desperate attempt to contain an enemy that had already accomplished its mission and disappeared without a trace. What terrified the German command more than the deaths themselves was the mystery surrounding the outbreak's origin. Military doctors had traced the infection patterns, interviewed survivors, examined every possible vector of transmission, and arrived at a conclusion that made no strategic sense. The disease had emerged simultaneously across multiple locations with no apparent connection, except that all the initial victims were officers of similar rank who had no social contact outside of official duties. The randomness of it haunted them, The possibility that Typhus could simply manifest anywhere, strike anyone, regardless of precautions or protocols. They never considered the barbershop, because their investigation focused on places where large groups gathered, on food preparation facilities and water sources, on the logical targets of biological warfare, and a single-chair barbershop where men received individual attention in sanitized comfort simply did not fit their model of how disease spread or how resistance fighters operated. Wazowski watched this chaos unfold from behind his shop window, a silent observer to the consequences of his actions, and the weight of it settled into his bones like radiation poisoning. He had killed men. There was no euphemism that could soften that reality. And while those men had been participants in an evil occupation, many of them had also been young, far from home, following orders they barely understood. Weiss had died screaming for his mother, delirious with fever, his body covered in the characteristic rash that gave typhus its alternative name, spotted fever. The reports that filtered through the Polish underground described hospital wards filled with suffering that transcended politics or nationality. Human beings reduced to writhing, fever-racked creatures begging for relief that medicine could not provide. Wazowski had unleashed this suffering with deliberate intent, had calculated the cost and decided it was acceptable. But accepting the necessity of an action did not erase the moral burden of having performed it, and he began to understand why soldiers who survived wars often spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had done in the name of victory. Yet even as guilt gnawed at him during sleepless nights, Wazowski could not deny the strategic success of his operation. The German administration in Warsaw had effectively ground to a halt, paralyzed by fear and suspicion, with officers refusing assignments to Poland and requesting transfers to virtually any other occupied territory. The systematic deportations that had been running with clockwork efficiency had slowed to a crawl, as the personnel needed to organize and execute them fell ill or were reassigned to deal with the health crisis. The underground estimated that Wazowski's barbershop plague had saved at least 2,000 lives by disrupting the machinery of destruction, buying time for families to hide, for resistance networks to reorganize, for information about the death camps to spread and allow some to escape. These were lives that would never know who had saved them, would never learn about the quiet barber who had transformed his shop into a weapon, and Wazowski accepted that anonymity as the price of his survival, knowing that recognition would mean exposure, and exposure would mean death. By the 6th week of the outbreak, the German military medical establishment had committed resources to Warsaw that would have been better deployed treating wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was bleeding itself white against Soviet resistance. Epidemiologists from the University of Berlin arrived with their microscopes and their charts, convinced they would quickly identify the source and restore order to what they viewed as a fundamentally solvable problem, but Warsaw defeated them as thoroughly as it had defeated every other German attempt to impose rational control on the chaos of occupation. They tested water supplies, examined livestock, inspected sewage systems, and conducted door-to-door health screenings that terrorized the Polish population, but revealed nothing except that the typhus remained stubbornly confined to German personnel, a pattern so unusual that some of the doctors began whispering about possibilities that their scientific training told them were impossible. Targeted biological warfare of a sophistication that even the most advanced laboratories in the Reich could not achieve. The breakthrough in the German investigation came not from medical science, but from bureaucratic thoroughness, when a junior officer tasked with reviewing requisition records noticed an anomaly in the timeline. Every infected officer had submitted expense reports in the weeks before falling ill, and buried in those mundane financial documents was a pattern. They had all claimed reimbursement for personal grooming services, haircuts, and shaves obtained from local Polish establishments during the same narrow window of time. The discovery triggered immediate action, with Gestapo agents fanning out across Warsaw to inspect every barbershop, beauty salon, and bathhouse that had serviced German personnel. And Wazowski received word of the impending raid from a sympathetic Polish clerk in the German administrative offices who risked her life to send a runner to his door. He had approximately 4 hours before the Gestapo arrived, 4 hours to decide whether to flee into the underground network, that had offered him sanctuary multiple times, or to stay and face an interrogation that would almost certainly end with his execution. The calculus of that decision was complicated by factors that transcended personal survival. Wazowski's family had already been moved to a safe house on the outskirts of Warsaw, smuggled out under cover of darkness by resistance operatives who understood that the barber's wife and daughters were now targets by association. But his shop itself contained traces of his work that a thorough forensic examination might reveal. He had been meticulous in destroying the obvious evidence, but microscopic residue could remain in the pipes, in the wooden grain of his work tables, in places he could not reach or clean without arousing suspicion. More importantly, his disappearance would confirm German suspicions and trigger reprisals against the entire neighborhood, collective punishment that would see innocent families dragged from their homes and shot in the street as a warning against harboring terrorists. The choice was between certain death for himself and probable death for dozens of others, and Wazowski made the decision that he had been trained by 3 years of occupation to make. He stayed. When the Gestapo arrived that afternoon, they found Eugeniusz Wazowski sitting calmly in his barber chair, reading a newspaper, his shop immaculate and orderly, every tool in its designated place. The agents tore through the establishment with methodical brutality, breaking mirrors, ripping up floorboards, smashing the porcelain sink to examine the plumbing beneath, and finding absolutely nothing that suggested anything other than a legitimate business operated by a Polish tradesman trying to survive the war. They interrogated him for 7 hours in the back room, demanding to know about his client list, his suppliers, his associations, and Wazowski answered every question with the servile deference that had protected him for so long, providing detailed records that he had carefully falsified weeks earlier, showing receipts for towels purchased from German suppliers, registration papers that documented his business license, even testimonials from Jerry, man clients who had praised his work before the outbreak began. The Gestapo wanted to arrest him anyway, operating on instinct rather than evidence, but they were constrained by a problem that Wazowski had anticipated. They had already arrested and executed so many Polish service workers that the infrastructure supporting the German occupation was on the verge of collapse. Every barber, tailor, cook and cleaner they shot was one less person available to maintain the comfort and efficiency that German officers demanded, and the occupation authorities were caught between their desire for vengeance and their need for functioning services. In the end, pragmatism won out, and Wazowski was released with a warning and placed under surveillance, his shop designated as approved for continued operation, but with the understanding that any future illness among German clients would result in immediate execution. He returned to his empty shop that night, sat in the chair where he had infected Hauptmann Weiss, and allowed himself the luxury of shaking uncontrollably for 10 minutes before forcing his hands to steady and beginning the process of rebuilding his cover, knowing that the game was not over, that survival required him to continue the performance of harmless servility even as the bodies of his victims were being buried in German military cemetery. Across occupied Poland, the surveillance that descended on Wazowski's life after his interrogation was suffocating in its completeness, transforming every moment of his existence into a performance for an audience that never slept and never looked away. 2 Gestapo informants took up permanent residence in the apartment across the street, their silhouettes visible behind curtains as they documented every person who entered or exited the barbershop, every conversation conducted within earshot, every deviation from routine that might suggest clandestine activity. The barber understood that his usefulness to the resistance had ended the moment he became a person of interest, that any further contact with underground networks would endanger not just himself, but everyone connected to him, and so he severed those ties completely, becoming exactly what the Germans wanted him to be, a frightened tradesman focused solely on survival, a man broken by interrogation and too terrified to do anything except cut hair and collect his meager earnings. It was the most difficult role he had ever played because it required him to abandon the secret pride he had felt in his mission, to bury the knowledge that he had struck a genuine blow against the occupation, and to present to the world a face of defeat and submission. The German officers eventually returned to his shop, not because they trusted him, but because the alternative barbershops staffed by imported German personnel were expensive, inefficient, and failed to provide the level of service that Wazowski had perfected over decades of practice. They came with visible wariness, examining the towels before they touched their faces, watching his hands with hawk-like attention, some of them even bringing their own shaving implements and demanding that Wazowski use only those tools. He accommodated every paranoid request with patient understanding, never showing frustration or resentment, allowing them to believe that their caution was justified and that he posed no threat beyond the general untrustworthiness they ascribed to all Poles. The truth was that Wazowski had no intention of attempting another infection, not because his conscience had finally overwhelmed his resolve, but because the tactical window had closed. The Germans were now alert to the possibility of biological sabotage, and any new outbreak would trigger an investigation that would trace back to him with mathematical certainty. What the occupiers never discovered, what their surveillance and their suspicions never penetrated, was that Wazowski's operation had never been limited to his own shop. Dr. Matulewicz had taken the typhus cultivation technique and shared it with 3 other resistance doctors working in different districts of Warsaw, and they in turn had recruited their own agents, a laundress who serviced officer quarters, a tailor who altered German uniforms, a masseuse who treated military personnel for stress-related ailments. The barbershop had been the proof of concept, the demonstration that biological warfare could be conducted by ordinary civilians using minimal resources, and while Wazowski himself was now neutralized by surveillance, the methodology had metastasized beyond his control. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, German forces across occupied Poland experienced sporadic outbreaks of typhus that defied epidemiological explanation, appearing and disappearing with no apparent pattern, each incident small enough to avoid triggering a full-scale investigation, but collectively significant enough to drain resources, damage morale, and remind every German soldier that the conquered population possessed weapons that could not be confiscated or detected. The psychological impact of this invisible war manifested in ways that traditional resistance activities never achieved, corroding the fundamental assumption of invulnerability that had sustained the German war machine through its early victories. Officers who had enthusiastically volunteered for service in the occupied territories now requested reassignment, citing health concerns that their superiors could not dismiss as cowardice because the threat was demonstrably real. The mortality rate from typhus among German personnel in Poland exceeded the casualty rate from partisan attacks by a factor of 3, and while the absolute numbers remained relatively small, the randomness of the disease created a pervasive anxiety that no amount of military discipline could suppress. Soldiers began refusing to interact with Polish civilians unless absolutely necessary, which paradoxically made them less effective occupiers because the intelligence gathering and population control that sustained the occupation required daily contact with the people they were subjugating. Wazowski observed these developments from his enforced isolation, gleaning information from the nervous chatter of officers who sat in his chair and complained about conditions in Poland, about the mysterious illnesses that seemed to follow German units wherever they went, about the growing consensus that this assignment was cursed in ways that France or Denmark had never been. He never acknowledged these conversations beyond sympathetic murmurs, never allowed his expression to betray the satisfaction he felt at their fear, but alone at night in the apartment where he now lived, separated from his family, he permitted himself the knowledge that his actions had mattered, that the weapon he had forged in desperation had proven more effective than he had dared to hope. The cost had been high, measured in nightmares about Weiss's death screams, and in the permanent separation from his wife and daughters who remained in hiding. But the occupation's machinery had been damaged in ways that bullets and bombs could never achieve, and that knowledge sustained him through the long months of surveillance and suspicion that followed. The climax of Wazowski's silent war arrived not with dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, grinding collapse of German administrative efficiency in Warsaw, a bureaucratic disintegration that by autumn of 1943 had reached catastrophic proportions. The typhus outbreaks, both real and imagined, had created a crisis of confidence that paralyzed decision-making at every level of the occupation hierarchy, with officers refusing to authorize operations that required close contact with Polish civilians and medical personnel, demanding quarantine protocols so extensive that they effectively shut down entire districts of the city. The deportation apparatus that had functioned with industrial precision throughout 1942 had slowed to sporadic, disorganized raids that gave targeted populations time to hide or flee, and the labor conscription programs that had supplied German factories with slave workers now struggled to meet quotas because the personnel responsible for organizing roundups were either sick, dead, or too terrified of infection to perform their duty. ISS, the German High Command, watching their occupation dissolve into chaos, demanded explanations and solutions, but the doctors and administrators on the ground in Warsaw could offer neither because they were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not defeat. What made the situation truly unbearable for the occupiers was the asymmetry of suffering. While typhus ravaged German personnel with brutal efficiency, the Polish population seemed mysteriously resistant to the same outbreaks, a statistical anomaly that German medical researchers could not explain within the framework of their racial ideology. The truth was simpler and more damning than they could acknowledge. The disease struck hardest in conditions of relative comfort and cleanliness, where immune systems had been sheltered from the constant low-level exposure to pathogens that characterized life in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions the Germans had imposed on Polish civilians. The very population that Nazi propaganda characterized as inferior and disease-ridden was demonstrating biological resilience that their supposed Aryan superiors lacked, and this inversion of expected outcomes gnawed at German confidence in ways that military defeats never could. The officers who still visited Wazowski's shop spoke in hushed tones about colleagues who had developed paranoid obsessions with hygiene, who refused to touch anything Polish-made, who had requested transfer to the Eastern Front, where at least the enemy you faced came at you with weapons you could see. By December of 1943, the cumulative effect of the Typhus campaign had achieved what no single act of resistance ever could. It had made Warsaw ungovernable through conventional occupation methods. The German administration had been forced to import thousands of additional personnel to replace the sick and dead, but the newcomers arrived already infected with the fear that permeated every conversation about service in Poland, and their effectiveness was compromised from day one. Supply chains that depended on Polish labor had collapsed or become unreliable, forcing the Germans to divert resources from the war effort to maintain their own occupation infrastructure. Most significantly, the intelligence networks that had allowed the Gestapo to infiltrate and destroy resistance cells had been severely degraded because informants and collaborators had become targets of a different kind of suspicion. Any Pole who worked too closely with Germans was now viewed by both sides as a potential disease vector, untouchable and isolated in ways that made them useless for gathering information. Wazowski watched this disintegration from his barbershop, still under surveillance, but increasingly irrelevant to the Gestapo agents who had more pressing concerns than monitoring a single barber. The informants across the street had been reassigned after one of them contracted typhus, and while he remained on official watch lists, the intensity of observation had diminished to occasional random checks that he could anticipate and prepare for. He had not seen his family in 8 months, receiving only coded messages through intermediaries that confirmed they were alive and safe in the countryside, hidden among farmers who asked no questions and kept no records. The separation was a constant ache, a wound that never healed, but he understood that their survival depended on maintaining the fiction that he was a broken man, isolated and defeated, no longer worth the effort of detailed surveillance. The irony was that this fiction had become partially true. The psychological toll of his actions, the accumulated weight of guilt and loss and enforced solitude, had transformed him into a hollow version of the man who had first pressed an infected towel against Hauptmann Weiss's face. Yet even in this diminished state, Wazowski continued to serve a purpose he had never intended, becoming a symbol within the underground resistance of what ordinary civilians could achieve against impossible odds. Stories of the barbershop plague circulated through secret networks, details often exaggerated or distorted, transforming him into a legend that bore little resemblance to the quiet, haunted man who stood behind his chair each morning. The resistance used his example to recruit others, to demonstrate that sophisticated weapons and military training were not prerequisites for striking meaningful blows against the occupation, and Dr. Matulewicz reported that the Typhus methodology had been adopted by resistance cells as far away as Krakow and Łódź, each group adapting the technique to their local circumstances and targets. Wazowski had become the unwitting architect of a new form of warfare, one that would influence partisan tactics for the remainder of the war and beyond, though he would never receive credit or recognition for innovations that military historians would later struggle to categorize or understand. The true magnitude of what Wazowski had unleashed became apparent in the winter of 1944, when German military medical records, later captured by Soviet forces and examined by historians decades after the war, revealed numbers that told a story the Third Reich had desperately tried to suppress. Between February 1943 and January 1944, typhus had killed 89 German military personnel in occupied Poland and hospitalized over 300 more, with the majority of deaths concentrated among officers and administrative staff rather than frontline troops. The economic cost was even more devastating. The Wehrmacht had spent the equivalent of 12 million Reichsmarks on medical treatment, quarantine facilities, and replacement personnel, resources that could have equipped 2 full infantry divisions for combat operations. More importantly, the psychological damage was incalculable, manifesting in transfer requests, desertion rates among occupation forces that exceeded those in combat zones, and a recruitment crisis that made Poland the least desirable posting in the entire German military. The barbershop plague had achieved strategic disruption on a scale that would have required thousands of resistance fighters using conventional methods, and it had done so at minimal cost and with 0 casualties among the Polish civilian population. The breaking point came in March of 1944, when the German High Command made the unprecedented decision to abandon their doctrine of total control in Warsaw and implement what they internally termed a policy of administrative distancing. German personnel were ordered to minimize direct contact with Polish civilians, to utilize remote command structures wherever possible, and to rely increasingly on collaborationist police forces for day-to-day occupation duties. This withdrawal created power vacuums that the Polish underground exploited ruthlessly, establishing shadow governments in neighborhoods where German presence had become sporadic, organizing relief efforts for starving families, and preparing for the eventual uprising that would come later that summer. Wazowski, still operating his barbershop under nominal surveillance, became an unlikely witness to the occupation's retreat, watching as the officers who once filled his appointment book disappeared, replaced by nervous enlisted men who came only when ordered and left as quickly as possible, their eyes never meeting his, their bodies rigid with barely suppressed fear. The final act of Wazowski's personal war occurred on a morning in late June, when Dr. Matulewicz appeared at the barbershop for the first time in over a year, his face gaunt and aged beyond his years, carrying news that the resistance leadership had authorized a general uprising against the German occupation. The Warsaw Uprising would begin in August, and the underground needed every asset, every weapon, every person who could contribute to the fight. But Matulewicz had not come to recruit Wazowski for the battle ahead. Instead, he delivered a message that the resistance command had evaluated the Barber's situation and determined that his most valuable contribution would be survival, that his story needed to be preserved for a future when the world would need to understand how ordinary people had fought back against impossible evil using nothing but courage and improvised weapons. Wazowski was being ordered to evacuate Warsaw before the uprising began, to take his knowledge and his testimony into the countryside and wait for liberation, because the leadership understood that heroes who died in doomed battles were less useful than witnesses who survived to tell the truth. The decision to flee felt like cowardice after everything he had endured, like abandoning his city in its moment of greatest need. But Wazowski had learned through brutal experience that effective resistance required subordinating personal honor to strategic necessity. On the 1st of August, 1944, as the first shots of the Warsaw Uprising echoed through the streets and Polish fighters emerged from hiding to challenge the occupation, Eugeniusz Wazowski slipped out of the city through underground tunnels that ran beneath the Vistula River, carrying nothing except the clothes on his back and a small leather journal in which he had documented in coded entries the methodology and timeline of his Typhus operation. He emerged into the countryside as Warsaw burned behind him, the smoke visible for miles, and began the long walk toward the village where his family waited, knowing that the barber shop that had been his weapon and his prison was almost certainly already destroyed, reduced to rubble by German artillery determined to crush the uprising with overwhelming force. The uprising lasted 63 days before the Germans finally suppressed it, killing over 200,000 Polish civilians in the process and systematically demolishing what remained of Warsaw until the city was little more than a field of ruins. Wazowski listened to reports of the battle from his hiding place in the countryside, powerless to help, haunted by the knowledge that his weapon of disease and fear had bought time and disrupted the occupation, but had not been enough to prevent this final catastrophe. Yet even in the ashes of defeat, the Typhus campaign's legacy persisted. German forces that might have been deployed to crush the uprising more quickly had been diverted to deal with continuing health crises across occupied Poland, and the psychological damage inflicted on occupation forces had contributed to the hesitation and disorganization that allowed the uprising to last as long as it did. The barber shop might have been destroyed, the city might have been reduced to rubble, but the proof that ordinary civilians could wage sophisticated warfare against a modern military machine had been established, documented, and preserved for a future that would need those lessons. Liberation came to Poland not as the joyous release from tyranny that Wazowski had imagined during the darkest days of occupation, but as the replacement of one totalitarian regime with another, the Soviet Red Army sweeping across the country in January 1945 with an agenda that had little room for celebrating the individual acts of resistance that had sustained Polish hope through 6 years of German brutality. The barber emerged from his rural hiding place to find Warsaw transformed into a landscape of total destruction. Entire neighborhoods erased from existence, the street where his shop had stood now indistinguishable from 1,000 other piles of rubble that stretched to the horizon. He searched for 3 days before finding the approximate location of his barber shop, marked only by a fragment of his shattered mirror embedded in the frozen ground, and he stood there in the snow, understanding that the physical evidence of his war had been obliterated as thoroughly as the lives of the officers he had infected. The new Soviet authorities had no interest in stories about biological sabotage conducted by individual civilians, preferring narratives of organized communist resistance that fit their ideological requirements. And Wazowski quickly learned that survival in this new regime required the same careful anonymity that had protected him under the Germans. The reunion with his family, when it finally occurred in the spring of 1945, was marked by a distance that no amount of time could have created alone, the separation having transformed his wife and daughters into people he recognized but no longer fully knew. They had survived their own war in the countryside, enduring different dangers and developing different scars, and the man who returned to them was not the neighborhood barber who had sent them away, but someone harder, quieter, carrying knowledge that could never be fully shared or understood. His daughters, now teenagers, looked at him with a mixture of love and uncertainty, sensing that their father harbored secrets that made him unreachable in ways that physical distance never had. Wazowski attempted to resume some semblance of normal life, finding work in a collective farms administrative office, because Warsaw had no need for barbers in a city without people, but the mundane tasks of record-keeping and supply management felt like punishment after the intensity of his wartime mission, a slow suffocation of purpose that left him hollow and restless. Dr. Matulewicz had survived the war as well, though barely, emerging from the ruins of the Warsaw uprising with injuries that left him partially disabled and a psychological fragility that manifested in paranoid episodes where he became convinced that the Gestapo was still searching for evidence of their biological warfare campaign. The two men met periodically in the years immediately following liberation, always in public places where their conversations could appear casual and innocent, and during these meetings they debated what to do with the knowledge they possessed. Matulewicz wanted to publish their findings in medical journals to contribute to the scientific understanding of disease transmission and resistance tactics. But Wazowski understood that such revelations in the current political climate would be dangerous, that the Soviet authorities would view their unauthorized biological warfare program as evidence of dangerous independence and punish them accordingly. The compromise they reached was silence, at least for the present, preserving their documentation in hidden locations and waiting for a political environment that might allow the truth to emerge without destroying them in the process. The cost of that silence became apparent as the years passed, and Wazowski watched the narrative of Polish resistance being systematically rewritten to glorify communist partisans while erasing or minimizing the contributions of non-communist fighters and civilians who had waged their own wars against the occupation. The barbershop plague disappeared from official histories, its victims attributed to natural outbreaks or unexplained illness, and the strategic disruption it had caused to the German occupation was credited to conventional partisan activities that fit more comfortably into Soviet propaganda narratives. Wazowski made one attempt to correct the record, submitting a carefully sanitized account of his activities to a government historical commission in 1948, and received in response a visit from security officers who strongly suggested that he had misremembered events and that further discussion of biological sabotage would be interpreted as spreading dangerous misinformation. He understood the message and retreated back into silence, adding this final defeat to the collection of compromises and suppressions that had become the defining characteristic of his post-war existence. Yet, despite the official silence, stories about the mysterious Barber who had poisoned German officers circulated through informal networks of resistance survivors, acquiring mythical qualities as they passed from person to person, the details becoming increasingly dramatic and divorced from the reality of what had actually occurred. Wazowski heard these stories occasionally, whispered versions of his own life that bore little resemblance to his memories, and he never corrected them because the legend served a purpose that the truth could not. It gave people hope that individual action mattered, that ordinary civilians could strike meaningful blows against tyranny, and that the powerful were never as invulnerable as they appeared. The real Eugeniusz Wazowski might have been forgotten, buried under Soviet revisionism and the general amnesia that settled over Poland after the war, but the mythical Barber who had weaponized disease against the Third Reich lived on in the collective memory of a people who needed to believe that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The true story of Eugeniusz Wazowski remained buried in silence and censorship for nearly 4 decades, emerging into public consciousness only after the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed Polish historians to access archives that had been sealed since the end of the war. In 1991, a researcher examining German military medical records discovered the statistical anomaly that had haunted occupation authorities in Warsaw. The inexplicable concentration of typhus deaths among officers who had no apparent epidemiological connection except their shared use of local Polish services. The discovery triggered an investigation that eventually led to Wazowski himself, by then an elderly man living in quiet obscurity in a small apartment in Łódź, and when historians arrived at his door requesting an interview, he initially refused to speak, decades of enforced silence having become a habit too deeply ingrained to break easily. It took weeks of gentle persuasion before he finally agreed to tell his story, and when he did, presenting the leather journal he had preserved through 5 decades of political upheaval, the historians understood they were witnessing the revelation of one of the war's most sophisticated and successful acts of civilian resistance. What made Wazowski's operation remarkable was not just its tactical success, but its demonstration of a principle that military strategists had consistently underestimated: that asymmetric warfare conducted by motivated civilians using improvised methods could achieve strategic effects far beyond their apparent capabilities. The barbershop plague had cost the Third Reich more in treasure, manpower and morale than dozens of conventional partisan attacks, and it had done so while maintaining operational security so complete that the enemy never definitively identified the source of the threat. Modern military historians studying the operation have noted its sophistication, the way Wazowski instinctively understood principles of plausible deniability, target selection, and psychological warfare that professional intelligence agencies spend years teaching their operatives. He had transformed his intimate knowledge of his enemy's routines and vulnerabilities into a weapon more devastating than any bomb, proving that detailed observation and creative thinking could overcome vast disparities in resources and power. The recognition that eventually came to Wazowski in his final years felt both vindicating and hollow. Medals and honors awarded by governments that had spent decades suppressing his story, official ceremonies that could not restore the years lost to enforced anonymity or reunite him with the family members who had died without knowing the full truth of what he had done. He gave interviews to journalists and historians, always careful to emphasize the moral complexity of his actions, refusing to accept characterization as a simple hero, and insisting that the use of disease as a weapon had been a desperate measure born from impossible circumstances rather than a tactic he would recommend or celebrate. When asked if he had regrets, he spoke about Hauptmann Weiss, about the screams that still haunted his dreams, about the knowledge that biological warfare, once unleashed, could not be precisely controlled or easily contained. He maintained that his actions had been necessary and effective, but also that they had cost him something essential in his own humanity, a price he had paid willingly, but that no one should romanticize or minimize. Eugeniusz Wazowski died in 1996 at the age of 94, having lived long enough to see his story finally told, but not long enough to witness the full impact of his testimony on contemporary understanding of resistance warfare. His funeral was attended by historians, veterans of the Warsaw Uprising, and a handful of elderly survivors who remembered the mysterious illnesses that had struck the German occupation forces, and in the eulogies delivered over his grave, speakers struggled to adequately capture the contradictions of a man who had been simultaneously a healer and a killer, a coward and a hero, a war criminal by any technical definition, and yet undeniably a patriot. Child who had served his country with extraordinary courage. The leather journal that documented his typhus operation now resides in the archives of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, its coded entries deciphered and analyzed by researchers studying the full spectrum of resistance tactics employed during the Nazi occupation. And it stands as testimony to the resourcefulness and determination of civilians who refused to accept defeat even when every conventional form of resistance seemed impossible. The legacy of the barbershop plague extends far beyond its immediate tactical success or its contribution to disrupting the German occupation of Warsaw, residing instead in the uncomfortable questions it raises about the ethics of resistance warfare and the lengths to which ordinary people can be driven by extraordinary evil. Wazowski's story challenges comfortable narratives about World War II that divide the world neatly into heroes and villains, forcing confrontation with the reality that fighting absolute evil sometimes requires embracing methods that would be unconscionable in any other context. His operation proved that a single civilian with specialized knowledge and unflinching determination could inflict strategic damage on a modern military machine, but it also demonstrated the psychological and moral costs of wielding such power, the way that necessary actions can corrode the soul even as they serve righteous causes. In an era where asymmetric conflict and civilian resistance movements continue to shape global politics, the story of the barber who weaponized typhus against the Third Reich remains urgently relevant, a case study in both the potential and the peril of improvised warfare, waged by ordinary people against overwhelming oppression. The barbershop is gone, Warsaw was rebuilt, the Third Reich collapsed into ash and judgment, but the truth that Wazowski proved with infected towels and steady hands endures. That power, no matter how absolute it appears, is always vulnerable to those courageous enough to find its weaknesses and ruthless enough to exploit them without mercy.